Every few years, new quad-core CPUs grace the market, and for years we keep discussing the topic future-proofness. And it turns out that a couple years back, I looked into the future way too pessimistically. Luckily, it's not only me that turned out to be wrong, but a lot of you as well. And at the end of the day, that's great news for us consumers, because I wouldn't have expected this budget CPU by Intel to perform that well. But it sadly also comes with quite a few significant downsides. This, my dear friends, is the Intel Core i3-12100 equipped with only 4 cores and 8 threads, which a few years back was still considered a flagship core thread layout. This power dwarf can be had at an MSRP, the manufacturer's suggested retail price, of $125 if I'm not entirely mistaken. That would translate to a retail price of about $130 to $155 right now in March 2022, compared against AMD's somewhat current price to performance champion, that being the Ryzen 5 5600X with 6 cores and 12 threads. The Core i3 can be had for noticeably less money. The only better deal out there might still be the i3-12100F without any integrated graphics, if you don't rely on it. You're spending between $120 to $155 on that one. Still, we need to keep an eye out on the fact that the Ryzen 5 5600X doesn't feature 4 cores, but 6, therefore will come out on top in certain aspects. So how good is the i3-12100 really, and does it actually make sense to buy such a CPU? A huge thank you goes out to the diligent Spartan named EaseUS over at the hardware shop Equipper. After all, it's him that gets a hold of all the stuff I need for my reviews. However, I'm paying for everything out of my own pocket, and my thanks comes from the heart. Hashtag not sponsored. Other than with the previous Alder Lake CPUs I've reviewed, included with this i3-12100 finally is something more exciting, a stock cooler. It also goes to show that after years, Intel has finally redesigned it and made it look more modern. While I, as always, will be carrying out my tests with an AIO liquid cooler, I will also read out achieved clock speeds and temperatures with the stock cooler. As far as the specs are concerned, the i3-12100 comes equipped solely with P cores. As it's the case with the Alder Lake generation, Intel has, after all, introduced performance and efficiency cores, P and E cores for short. P cores usually come with 2 threads per core, whereas E cores not only clock lower, but offer us just a single thread per core. In the case of this Core i3 CPU, it doesn't matter though, they're all P cores. As mentioned in previous videos, Alder Lake is something more of a transitional platform from DDR4 to DDR5, meaning that consumers can either pick up motherboards with DDR4 or DDR5 slots. DDR5 memory, of course, currently is kinda pricey. Still, for the sake of completeness, I decided to benchmark with the latest memory type out there. The CPU I will install on my trusty Gigabyte Z690 Gaming X DDR5 motherboard, but quite frankly, since we're dealing with a CPU coming with a locked multiplier, thus not officially supporting overclocking, from a cost perspective, it doesn't make any sense to grab a motherboard with the Z690 chipset. It would be wiser to either go for H670, B660, or maybe even H610 to keep the platform costs down to a minimum. So my choice of memory also is way too extreme. That's 32 GB of G-Skill Trident Z5 DDR5 6000 MHz. Those Alder Lake CPUs I reviewed earlier before, paired with the very same motherboard, didn't quite run with 6000 MHz. So I had to content myself with a memory clock of 5800 MHz. Well, with today's i3-12100, I had to drop down one step further, at 5700 MHz, at least only a drop of 100 MHz. The tiny blue dwarf is being cooled by the Be Quiet Pure Loop 360mm AIO liquid cooler, which needless to say is pretty overkill, but as said before, I will also take a look at what this stock cooler is capable of. As for the graphics card, I'll once again go for the RTX 3090 to avoid most GPU limits. Of course, one certainly wouldn't normally pair a Core i3 CPU with such a fancy graphics card. According to hardware info, almost a consistent 4.1 GHz can be read out with all 4 cores under full load. As a matter of fact, with the stock cooler I get the exact same clock speed, which is great news for all of you that are looking to save money. The max rated boost clock of roughly 4.3 GHz is being achieved, no matter which of the 2 cooling solutions comes into play. I can also report back with positive stuff regarding noise levels of the stock cooler. It isn't actually that loud, unless you go full speed. Even in-game, I'm pretty much reading out a consistent 4.1 GHz. So there's only one thing left to mention, and that is that all Alder Lake CPUs I've tested with 32 GB of DDR5 5800/5700 MHz RAM, for that matter with today's CPU, whereas all the remaining platforms were tested with 16 GB of DDR4 3200 MHz. I did, however, put a lot of focus on the fact that the capacity in itself didn't influence any of the tests. The following are my achieved results. Right off the bat, I'd like to let you all know that we have to realize the single core performance of the i3-12100 as opposed to those higher ranking Core i5, i7 and i9 Alder Lake models is measurably lower. Nonetheless, in terms of single core performance, we're still seeing significantly faster cores than what AMD is offering us with their Ryzen 5 5600X. Still, it must be clearly pointed out, as already mentioned in the beginning of this video, that AMD with 6 cores and 12 threads on the 5600X takes the lead in aspects such as productivity. In the tests I carried out, there's not a single scenario in which the i3-12100 beat the 5600X in terms of raw performance. Those 4 cores on the 12100, after all, are not that much faster to make up for it. But let's be perfectly honest for a second here. Who actually purchases a quad-core for rendering and the like? The majority of consumers interested in this CPU would most likely put together a nice cheap office or gaming rig. In the aspect gaming, the i3-12100 clearly distances itself from its bigger brothers that cost a lot more but bring more cores to the table. Still, the 12100 often not just easily keeps up with the 5600X, but even manages to beat it in a few instances, albeit these are wins that probably shouldn't be taken too seriously, since the benchmarks were conducted with an RTX 3090. When pairing with graphics cards that make a whole lot more sense, you hardly will be able to tell any difference between the 5600X and 12100, not in the aspect gaming. Nonetheless, we still need to accept and respect the theory here. But please don't get me wrong here, the i3-12100, even in gaming, occasionally suffers big losses. The 5600X is a tough nut to crack and plays out its big strength due to its 2 additional cores. One should never forget the whole platform cost, though. As a matter of fact, Intel, as funny as this may sound, currently is the cheaper alternative when picking the right motherboard. Of course, one would have to go with DDR4 memory, that is. Not a big deal since there aren't any too big noteworthy performance differences when it comes to CPU performance between DDR4 and DDR5 right now. Things are looking real good for the i3-12100 when it comes down to power consumption. Not a surprise actually, certainly a very power efficient CPU. At a mere TDP of 60 watts, the temperatures are of no concern at all. Even the tiny stock cooler can handle the 12100 without any issues. So to sum things up, all I can say is the Intel Core i3-12100 offers a lot. From a pure technical standpoint, maybe nothing too special really, but certainly a great deal from a price to performance perspective, if you will. Definitely some strong competition for AMD. For us consumers, that's great news actually, when there's a nice battle going on between Intel and AMD. With that being said, thanks a lot for watching everyone, and until next time.